There is a car behind glass in a museum in South Bend, Indiana, and on the side of it, painted by hand, are the words, Car Number 1, Studebaker's Second Century. It was meant to be a beginning. It turned out to be an ending. It is one of the last automobiles the Studebaker company ever built in the United States, and the men who bolted it together were, most of them, about to lose the pensions they had spent their whole working lives earning. But here is the part that should bother you. When that happened, when thousands of them got almost nothing, the company had broken no law. Nobody went to jail. Nobody could even be sued. What you are looking at is not the story of a crime. It is the story of how America watched a legal, orderly, entirely permissible betrayal, and realized it had no law on the books to stop the next one. So it wrote one. The company that built that car had, a century earlier, built the carriage that carried Abraham Lincoln to Ford's Theater on the last night of his life. That carriage sits in the same museum today, a few rooms away from the last car. Studebaker was that old and that woven into the country, and in the winter of 1963, it walked away from the people who had built it, and in doing so, it forced the United States to rewrite the rules of retirement for everyone. Let me show you how that happened, because the way a country fixes something like this is stranger and slower, and more human than you would think. Start with a man named Jack Caldwell. In December of 1963, he was a young reporter at the South Bend Tribune, and he was the one who got the story. Studebaker had not confirmed anything yet. The company was still holding the line, still not admitting what was coming, but Caldwell had it, and the paper ran it, and it ran it in the loudest possible way, because in that era, South Bend was a newspaper town. This was the read-all-about-it era, when the Tribune was an afternoon paper, and carriers took the freshly printed edition and walked it right out to the factory gates to sell it to the men coming off shift. So picture the actual afternoon. December 9th, 1963. The whistle blows, the shift ends, and thousands of Studebaker workers come pouring out through Gate 1 on Sample Street, tired, thinking about supper, thinking about Christmas coming in a couple of weeks, and they do not know yet. They have no idea. And there, right outside the gate, are the newspaper carriers, holding up the edition, still warm from the presses, and the headline on it says, "The auto output is ending. The plant is closing. The cars are going to stop." Jack Caldwell remembered the reaction for the rest of his life, and he described it decades later. For a lot of the men, the first thing was simply disbelief. They would not accept it. Some of them got angry, even hostile, standing there in the cold reading it. And one worker, Caldwell remembered, kept hollering the same thing over and over. "It's not official yet. It's not official yet." As if saying it loudly enough could make it untrue, because Studebaker had always been there. It had been there since long before any of these men were born, since before their fathers were born. You did not close Studebaker. Studebaker was the reason South Bend existed in the first place. The idea that it could simply end was not something the mind could hold, and you have to layer in the timing to feel the full weight of it, because the country these men lived in was already in shock. This is December 9th, 1963. President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas just 17 days earlier. The whole nation was still raw, still grieving, still trying to make sense of a world that had come apart on live television. And now, in this one Indiana city, on top of the grief that everyone was carrying, came this. 2 weeks before Christmas, in the darkest, coldest part of the year, a whole community was handed the news that the thing its entire life was built on was going away. It is hard to imagine a worse moment for a worse announcement. To understand why that landed the way it did, you have to understand what Studebaker actually was, because it was not some fly-by-night operation that showed up and vanished. 5 brothers started it in South Bend in 1852. Henry and Clement first, then the others. They began as blacksmiths, the family trade, hammering iron over a fire. Then they made parts for wagons, then whole wagons. During the gold rush, they sold wheelbarrows to men heading west to dig for gold. During the Civil War, they built the wagons that carried supplies for the Union Army. And I told you about the Lincoln carriage at the start, but sit with it for a second, because it is not a coincidence. This was the company that built the carriage that carried Abraham Lincoln to Ford's Theater on the last night of his life. Studebaker was physically present at the hinge points of American history, building the things the country moved on, And then it did something almost no other wagon maker in the world managed to do. When the automobile arrived at the turn of the century, Studebaker crossed over. It started with electric cars, then gasoline, and it made the jump from the age of the horse to the age of the engine without dying in between. Most wagon companies simply vanished the moment cars appeared. Studebaker adapted and survived and grew. That is why, for the first half of the 20th century, it was one of the biggest employers in the state of Indiana and one of the most trusted names in American manufacturing. Its cars broke more than 300 speed records. Many of its designs came out of the famous Raymond Loewy studio, and they were some of the most beautiful shapes on the American road. At its peak, the South Bend operation employed something like 24,000 people. Think about what that number means for a single city. Fathers and sons on the same line. Grandfathers who had built wagons, and grandsons who built cars in the very same buildings. Whole neighborhoods where every other house had someone who clocked in at Studebaker. A man who owned a Studebaker dealership across the street from the factory later put it as plainly as it can be put. The history of this city, he said, is Studebaker, so understand what we are dealing with. This was not just the town's biggest company. It was the town's memory and the town's future poured into one set of brick buildings on the west side of South Bend. And that is exactly what made what came next so devastating, because the company that had survived the death of the wagon could not survive the thing that came for it in the 1950s. That thing was Detroit. After the Second World War, the American car market belonged to three companies: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. The big three. They were enormous. They could build cars cheaper than anyone else on Earth because they built so many of them, and that scale let them squeeze every smaller automaker in the country. And there had been a lot of smaller automakers once. In the 1920s, there were dozens of independent American car companies with names most people today have never heard. One by one, through the 1930s and 40s and 50s, the big three ground them down until almost none were left. By the early 1960s, Studebaker was nearly the last true independent still standing, and it was too small to win. It could not build cars as cheaply as Detroit. It could not afford to modernize its plants, some of which by then were more than 40 years old, slow and inefficient. So in 1954, to survive, Studebaker did what struggling companies do. It merged. It joined with another fading old name, the Packard Motor Car Company, to form the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. The theory was that two weak companies together might make one strong one. The reality was that Studebaker's finances turned out to be far worse than Packard had been told, and the merger nearly sank both of them at once. By 1956, the combined company was so close to collapse that it had to hand its management over to an outside firm, the aircraft maker Curtiss-Wright, just to keep operating. And here is the quiet, telling part. Curtiss-Wright's real interest was not in saving Studebaker's cars. It was in Studebaker's losses, because those losses came with huge tax credits that a profitable aircraft company could use. So under that management, Studebaker-Packard began doing the thing that tells you a car company has stopped believing in itself. It started diversifying away from cars. It bought other kinds of businesses entirely. The people running it were already, in their own heads, building toward a future that did not have the South Bend assembly line in it. Now, the company did not die without a fight. It had two more real swings left, and they matter, because they are the reason the people of South Bend kept believing right up until the last minute. The first was the Lark. In 1959, Studebaker read the market correctly for once and built a small, sensible, affordable compact car, exactly what a lot of American families suddenly wanted in a tighter economy. And it worked. The Lark sold. The company made money again for a moment. It looked like Studebaker had finally found a corner of the market the giants had left open. But the reprieve lasted about a year, because the instant the big three saw that the compact market was real, they built their own. Ford brought out the Falcon. Chevrolet brought out the Corvair. Plymouth brought out the Valiant, and that was that. Studebaker had proven the compact market existed, and the giants simply walked in and took it, exactly the way they had taken everything else. The second swing was the most heartbreaking, because it was the best thing the company ever built. In 1962, Studebaker launched the Avanti, a low, sleek, fiberglass-bodied sports coupe designed by the Loewy team. It was genuinely beautiful and genuinely fast, and it carried advanced ideas, including real safety features that were years ahead of the rest of the industry. Critics adored it. It broke speed records out at the salt flats. The company's president, a man named Sherwood Egbert, planned to sell 20,000 of them in the first year. But the fiberglass bodies had production problems. The delays stacked up. Customers canceled their orders, and in that whole first year, Studebaker managed to build only about 1,200 cars. 1,200 against a plan of 20,000. In the very same stretch of time, Chevrolet built more than 23,000 Corvettes. The Avanti was, in the words of one historian, a brilliant car that arrived too late to save the company. Studebaker's best idea in a decade, and it barely moved the needle. And here is a detail worth holding on to, because it puts one specific man inside this story 2 years before the disaster. On the first day of 1962, the workers at the South Bend plant went on strike, and that strike dragged on for 38 days. It only ended when the president of Studebaker, Sherwood Egbert, sat down and personally reached an agreement with the president of the United Auto Workers, a man named Walter Reuther. Remember that name, because it is the most important name in this entire story. Reuther was already across the table from Studebaker's management, negotiating with this exact company 2 full years before the plant closed. He already knew Studebaker. He already knew what its contract said. He does not arrive in this story late. He is already in it, watching. So by the end of 1963, the picture was complete. The Lark reprieve was over. The Avanti had failed to sell. The management had already turned its attention to other businesses, and the payroll that had once been 24,000 had bled down year after year to only about 7,000 still working in South Bend, with thousands more already laid off and sitting at home, waiting for a callback that was never going to come. So no, the closing was not a bolt from a clear blue sky. Anyone who looked closely could see the company was dying, but there is a difference between knowing something is sick and being handed the death certificate at the factory gate 2 weeks before Christmas with no warning at all. And there was one part of this, one specific part, that almost nobody standing at those gates saw coming, the part that turned a sad economic story into a national scandal. The pensions. And to understand the pensions, you have to go back to something that had happened 13 years earlier, and it did not happen at Studebaker at all. It happened in Detroit, and it was supposed to be one of the great victories for the American worker. In 1949 and 1950, the United Auto Workers Union, led by that same Walter Reuther, sat down with the big 3 automakers and won something that had never really existed before for ordinary factory workers: a pension, a real one, a promise that if you gave the company your working life, the company would take care of you when you were too old to work. You have to understand how radical that was. For most of American history, if you were a factory worker, old age was simply a cliff. You worked until your body gave out, and then you were on your own, dependent on your children or on charity, or on nothing at all. Social Security had only just begun to change that, and it was thin. A private pension from your employer, on top of it, was the difference between a dignified old age and poverty. And Reuther set out to win that for auto workers. He called his strategy getting a foot in the door. He picked off Ford first. In 1949, to avoid a strike, Ford agreed to pay for the entire cost of a pension plan, and crucially, Ford agreed that the plan would be fully funded and actuarially sound, meaning the money would actually be there. Then Reuther moved on to Chrysler, and Chrysler would agree to match the pension, but refused to fully fund it. Reuther would not accept that, and he took Chrysler out on strike, a strike that lasted over 100 days. It was during that long, bitter fight that he coined the phrase that would follow this entire cause for the next 25 years. He talked about the men the system left behind, the men who were, in his words, too old to work and too young to die. Those contracts became known as the Treaty of Detroit, and they set the pattern for the whole American auto industry, Studebaker included. For the first time, An ordinary factory worker could expect a pension the way he expected a paycheck. It genuinely felt like the future had arrived, like the country had finally figured out how to take care of the people who built it. And in a way, it had. But buried inside the way these plans were actually built was a flaw. A flaw almost nobody was looking at, because everything was working, and that flaw is the entire reason this story exists. Here is the flaw, and I want to be careful with it, because it is the hinge everything turns on. When the Union negotiated Studebaker's pension plan back in 1949 and 1950, they made a choice about who gets paid first if there is ever not enough money to go around. And the choice they made, the choice that seemed completely reasonable at the time, was that the money would go first to the people who had already retired and to the people about to retire, the oldest workers, at the front of the line. Why would the union agree to that? Because it let the company promise bigger pensions. If you did not have to guarantee full benefits to every young worker, if you only really had to cover the ones near the end, you could afford to make the headline number look generous. Fewer people would ever actually qualify, so the promise cost less to make. It was a way to get a good-looking pension in the door. Reuther's foot in the door. And there was one more thing, the thing that would turn out to matter most of all. The contract did not actually require the company to keep enough money in the fund to pay everyone. It required Studebaker to make regular contributions. That is not the same thing. A company can make its payments and still have a fund that is nowhere near large enough to cover what it has promised, and that is exactly what Studebaker had. A pension fund that by the time the plant closed was short of what it owed by around $15 million. So you had a plan that paid the oldest first, that let the youngest go unguaranteed, and that was never legally required to hold enough money in the first place. For years, none of that mattered, because the plant kept running, and the checks kept clearing. The flaw was invisible as long as the company was alive. But the union had already seen what happens when a company like that dies, because it had happened once already, and almost nobody outside the union paid attention. In 1958, the Packard Company, which had merged with Studebaker a few years earlier, terminated the pension plan for its workers, and the Packard workers got even less than the Studebaker workers eventually would. It was a smaller event. It did not make the national news the way Studebaker would, but Walter Reuther saw it, and it frightened him, because it proved that the great victory of 1950, the pension, the future, could simply evaporate the day a company decided it was done. The promise was only as solid as the company making it, and companies died, so Reuther already knew, before Studebaker ever closed, that there was a hole in the floor. He just did not yet have the thing he needed to force the country to look at it. He needed an example so large, so public, so obviously unfair that people who had never thought about pensions in their lives would suddenly care. He needed a disaster. In December of 1963, he got one. The last car came off the South Bend line on December 20th, 1963. That is only 11 days after the workers found out at the gate. 11 days. 5 days before Christmas. And then the plant went quiet, and the quiet was the loudest thing that had ever happened to that city. Think about the scale of what left. A payroll worth about $45 million a year, gone from South Bend in an afternoon. That is not just 7,000 paychecks. That is every store, every diner, every movie theater, every barber and grocer and car dealer whose business depended on Studebaker workers having money to spend. When the paychecks stopped, those men stopped spending, and that triggered a second wave of layoffs and closures all across the city, a chain reaction of failure rippling out from the empty plant. The federal government treated it as a genuine emergency. 6 different cabinet-level departments got involved in the response, along with a whole list of other federal and state agencies. That is how big this was. This was not a local business closing. This was Washington scrambling. The local unemployment rate, which had been around 2% in November of 1963, shot up toward 9% within a few months. In a matter of weeks, one of America's proudest manufacturing towns had turned into a disaster zone. And then there is the detail that Jack Colwell, the reporter, remembered most, because he watched it happen in the pages of his own newspaper. In the months after the closing, a particular kind of entry started showing up in the death notices. It would be a former Studebaker worker, around 55 years old, dead, with no cause of death listed at all. And people in South Bend knew exactly what those blank obituaries meant. These were men who had lost their jobs, and then lost their pensions, and then, with nothing left and no way to start over at their age, simply gave up and died. The despair had a body count, and you could read it in the back pages of the local paper, one quiet obituary at a time. But the lost jobs, as terrible as they were only the first blow. The jobs, at least, some men could eventually replace. The second blow was the one that could not be replaced, the one that turned South Bend's local tragedy into the whole country's problem. It came a few weeks later when the company terminated the pension plan, opened the fund, and did the arithmetic on who was actually going to get paid. Here is that math, and it is worth slowing down for, because these are not abstractions. These are people. The plan covered around 10,500 workers. Roughly 3,600 of them had already retired, or were right at retirement age. Because of that clause, the one that put the oldest at the front of the line, those 3,600 got their full pensions. They were made whole. The system worked exactly as designed for them. Then came the next group, around 4,000 workers, aged 40 to 59, men in the middle of their lives who had given the company decades. They did not get their pensions. They got about 15 cents for every dollar they had been promised. 15 cents on the dollar after a working lifetime. And then the last group, around 2,900 workers, the ones with less than 10 years in. They got nothing at all. Zero. Now let me put a face on that middle group, the 4,000 at 15 cents, because the average is the whole story. The average worker in that group was 52 years old. The average worker in that group had 23 years of service. 23 years. Picture that man. He started at Studebaker in his late 20s. He gave it more than 2 decades. He is 52, which in 1963 is too old to easily start over and too young to retire. He did everything he was told. He showed up, he put in his time, he trusted the promise. And at the end of it, for 23 years of his life, he received 15 cents on the dollar and a plant that was now silent. He was, in the exact words of the old strike slogan, too old to work and too young to die. That is the human center of this whole story, and it is not a policy or a statistic. It is one 52-year-old man holding a pension worth almost nothing in a town where the only employer that ever mattered had just turned off the lights. And now we come to the thing that makes this story different from every other factory closing story, the thing that turned it from a tragedy into a law. Because your instinct watching this is to ask a simple question. How was this allowed? Why didn't those men sue? Somebody promised them a pension, the pension didn't come, that is a broken contract. Take the company to court. And the answer is the reason this entire video exists. They could not sue because Studebaker had not broken the contract. Read that again. Slowly. The company had not broken the contract. The contract, the one the union itself had negotiated back in 1950, said that the available money went first to the retired and the ready to retire. Studebaker did exactly that. The contract only required the company to make its regular contributions, not to keep the fund fully funded, and Studebaker had made its contributions. Every promise the company had legally made, it had kept. It had simply made promises that, when the company died, were physically impossible to fulfill, and it had never been legally required to make them possible. The New York Times, writing about it in 1964, put it in a sentence that is still chilling 60 years later. The paper explained that the union's own contract sent the money to the retired and the nearly retired first, and that this would take nearly all of it, leaving thousands of men in their 40s and 50s with nothing. And then the Times wrote the line that says everything. This, it said, is a calamity but not a crime. A calamity but not a crime. That is the whole problem in 5 words. What happened to those men was a catastrophe. It ruined lives. It killed some of them, if those blank obituaries meant what people thought they meant, and it was completely, provably legal. There was no villain to arrest. There was no lawsuit to win. Under the law as it existed in 1963, a company could promise you a pension, take your entire working life in exchange, and then vanish, owing you nothing it could be forced to pay. The men at Studebaker had no recourse under state law, and no recourse under federal law, because the federal law that would have protected them did not exist. And here is the part that makes it genuinely uncomfortable, the part that resists any easy villain. Because if you go looking for someone to blame, the company is only half the answer. The clause that put the oldest workers at the front of the line, the clause that left the 52-year-olds with 15 cents, that clause was in the contract the union negotiated. The UAW had agreed to it back in 1950, because at the time it was the way to win a bigger pension. Nobody in that room in 1950 was thinking about what would happen if the whole company died. They were thinking about getting the foot in the door. So the disaster at Studebaker was not the work of a single greedy corporation twisting the rules. It was the entire system, company and union and law together, doing exactly what everyone had agreed to and producing a catastrophe anyway. That is what makes it so hard to look at. There was no bad guy. There was just a gap, and everyone fell into it together. And that is the realization that changed America's retirement system. The country looked at South Bend and understood that the horror was not that a law had been broken. The horror was that no law had been broken. The whole system had worked exactly as written, and the result was thousands of ruined men. If you wanted to stop the next Studebaker, you could not sue anyone, and you could not arrest anyone. You had to reach into the rules themselves and change what was legal in the first place. And before we get to him, there is one thing you need to understand, because it is the difference between a sad local story and a story that changed the country. Studebaker was not alone. It was the biggest and the most visible, the one that put thousands of ruined men in one city all at once, which is why it became the symbol. But it was not unique. All across America in these years, the same thing was quietly happening on a smaller scale, over and over. The New York Times, in that same 1964 coverage, pointed out that Studebaker was only the loudest example. Around the same time, when a company called American Bakeries closed more than 100 bakeries and put roughly 1,000 people out of work, the same pattern repeated. The older and retired workers got what they were owed. Everyone else got a fraction, or nothing. Because the flaw was not a Studebaker flaw. It was a flaw in the entire private pension system as it existed in America. Every one of these plans was built on the same three weaknesses. The company was not required to keep enough money in the fund. There was no rule about when your benefits truly became yours, and there was nothing at all standing behind the promise if the company failed. Studebaker did not have a uniquely broken pension. Studebaker had a completely ordinary pension, and that was the terrifying part. If it could happen there, at one of the oldest and proudest names in American manufacturing, it could happen anywhere, to anyone. Millions of American workers were walking around believing they had a secure retirement, and they were all standing on the same hole in the floor. They just could not see it, because their companies had not died yet. That is what turned Studebaker from a tragedy into a movement. Not that it was rare, but that it proved the danger was everywhere, which brings us to the one man who had been waiting years for exactly this chance. If you find this kind of story worth your time, the way a single forgotten factory quietly rewrote the rules the rest of us live under, that is the whole reason this channel exists, so consider subscribing, because what Walter Reuther did next is the reason your pension and 30 million other people's pensions are safe today. Remember, Reuther had seen this coming since Packard collapsed in 1958. He already believed the private pension was built over a hole in the floor, and he already had the beginnings of a solution. The idea Reuther and the UAW had been developing was something they called pension reinsurance. The concept was simple, and in hindsight, obvious. If a single company's pension fund could collapse and leave its workers with nothing, then you needed something bigger than any single company standing behind those promises. A backstop, a pool, some larger entity that would step in and pay the workers when their own company's fund failed. Insurance, but for pensions. At the time, it was a radical thought, but Studebaker made it look less like a radical thought and more like common sense, because now everyone could see what happened without it. Reuther finally had his example, the disaster large enough and public enough to move the idea out of the Union Hall and onto the floor of Congress. But a union president cannot pass a federal law. For that, this needed a politician, and it found an unlikely one. His name was Jacob Javits, a Republican senator from New York, and in 1967, 4 years after Studebaker went dark, Javits introduced legislation to reform the private pension system. Now, on paper, this is a strange match. A New York Republican senator taking up the cause of unionized factory workers in Indiana. Pensions were not a natural Republican issue, but Javits had looked at the problem and concluded correctly that the entire private pension system was a promise the country could not actually keep, and that somebody had to force the issue. And here is what made him effective, the thing the policy experts around him kept forgetting. Javits understood that you do not move a country with actuarial tables and funding ratios. Nobody outside a handful of specialists can even follow that. You move a country with stories, specific ones, human ones. So Javits took the case for pension reform directly to the American public, and he did it by collecting and publicizing what were openly and deliberately called horror stories. Studebaker was the biggest and most famous of them, the Anchor case, but he gathered others too. Workers all over the country who had been promised a secure retirement and had received nothing. People whose companies had broken no law, exactly like Studebaker, and who had no way to fight it, exactly like Studebaker. Javits put those stories in front of the public through the press, and in front of his fellow senators in hearings, and he made a simple bet. He bet that once ordinary Americans saw enough of these cases, enough 52-year-old men with 23 years of service holding a pension worth 15 cents on the dollar, the emotional pressure would become impossible for Congress to ignore. And he was right. The stories worked in a way that arguments never could have. They overwhelmed the business groups who were lobbying hard against reform because it would cost them money. They overwhelmed even some of the labor organizations who had their own complicated reasons to be nervous about a federal system reaching into their pension funds. The horror stories cut straight through all of it, because you cannot argue with a ruined man. You can only look at him. And once enough of the public had looked, public opinion turned, and once public opinion had genuinely turned, Congress could no longer sit still. But it did not move fast, not even close. And this is the part of the story that nobody ever makes a movie about, the part that is genuinely important to sit with, because it is how real change actually happens in this country, and it is nothing like the way we imagine it. It took 11 years. Think about that. Studebaker closed at the end of 1963. The men lost their pensions in early 1964, and the law that finally fixed the problem was not signed until 1974, 11 years between the disaster and the remedy. A child born the month Studebaker closed was in the 5th grade before Congress did anything about it. And those 11 years were not quiet. They were a grind. Years of study commissions, years of congressional hearings where witness after witness laid out what had happened to them. Endless drafts of legislation, written and rewritten. And underneath all of it, a long, brutal fight over the details, because there is always someone who does not want a law like this. Business groups fought it, because forcing companies to fully fund their pensions and to insure them costs real money. Some labor groups had their own hesitations. There were fights over who would pay for the insurance system, fights over how strong the rules should be, fights over every clause and every comma. This is what pension reform actually looked like. Not a wave of righteous anger sweeping a bill into law. A decade of exhausting, technical, unglamorous trench warfare. And the man who had seen the whole thing coming did not live to see it end. Walter Reuther, who had built the modern American pension in 1949 and 1950, who had watched Packard collapse and understood the danger before anyone else, who had sat across the table from Studebaker itself and spent years pushing his reinsurance idea toward Washington, never saw the finish line. In 1970, 4 years before the law passed, Walter Reuther was killed in a plane crash. The man most responsible for the idea at the heart of ERISA did not live to see ERISA. So when you hear that a disaster like Studebaker led to a law, understand what actually sits inside that little word, led. It does not mean the country got angry and fixed it. The country got angry, and then a small number of people spent 11 years of their lives grinding through committee rooms and hearing transcripts and legislative language that nobody was watching, and some of them did not make it to the end. That is what it costs to turn a national feeling into a national rule. It is slow, it is boring, it is thankless, and it is the only thing that has ever actually worked. And then, on September 2nd, 1974, it happened. President Gerald Ford signed the Employee Retirement Income Security Act into law. Everyone calls it by its initials. ERISA. For the first time in American history, the men and women of the private workforce had clearly defined legal rights to their pension money. Ford said it plainly when he signed it. Under this law, he said, workers would have much more clearly defined rights to pension funds and greater assurance that the retirement dollars would be there when they were needed. The dollars would be there. That was the whole point. That was the thing that had not been true for the men at Studebaker. ERISA did several things at once. It forced companies to actually fund their pension promises, to keep enough money in the fund to cover what they owed, which was the exact failure at Studebaker. It set rules for when your pension benefits actually became yours, so a company could not dangle a promise it never intended to make real. And it created something entirely new, something that came directly out of Reuther's old idea of pension reinsurance. It created a government corporation whose entire job is to be the backstop, the pool, the thing that stands behind the promises when a company fails. It is called the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the PBGC, and it is the direct descendant of that idea Reuther had been carrying since he watched Packard collapse in 1958. If your company's pension plan fails today, if it terminates without enough money to pay what it owes, the PBGC steps in and pays you the benefits you earned, up to the limits the law sets. It is the thing that did not exist in December of 1963. It is the reason there has not been another Studebaker. Here is how big that turned out to be. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation today protects the retirement benefits of about 30 million American workers, retirees, and their families. 30 million people. Almost none of them have ever heard of Studebaker. Almost none of them know that the reason their pension is safe, the reason there is a federal agency standing behind it, traces back to a single factory in South Bend, Indiana, and to a group of men in their 50s who got 15 cents on the dollar and could not sue anyone for it. Those men did not get their pensions back. ERISA did not reach into the past and make them whole, but every worker protected since is protected because of what happened to them. Which brings us back to the car. It is still there, behind the glass, in the Studebaker National Museum on Chapin Street in South Bend. That museum opened in 2005, built to remember a company that had been gone for decades, and it holds more than 120 vehicles that trace the whole arc of what Studebaker was. The Conestoga wagons from the beginning, the presidential carriages, including the one that carried Lincoln, and the cars from the end, right up to that last one with Studebaker's second century painted on the side. A second century that never came. The company built its last American cars in South Bend in 1963, then kept building a few up in Canada until 1966, and then the automobile that had crossed over from the age of the wagon finally stopped for good. The old factory buildings on the 82-acre main campus stood empty and rotting for years after that. Eventually they came down, and the demolition took about 2 decades to finish, a slow erasure of the physical thing the town had been built around. But South Bend, to its enormous credit, did not stay in the grave. Other companies moved into the old buildings and the old machine shops, and put people who knew how to work with their hands back to work. The unemployment rate that had spiked to 9% was back down under 3% within a couple of years. The city found a way forward. Today, there is new development downtown, and the county recently landed a multi-billion-dollar electric vehicle battery plant, which is its own kind of full circle, a place that once built cars building the batteries that will move the next ones. But go into that museum and stand in front of the last car, and then walk a few rooms over and stand in front of the carriage that carried Lincoln to Ford's Theater, both of them built by the same company across the same long century, and you are standing inside the whole story at once. A company old enough and proud enough to have carried a president to his death, woven into the country for over 100 years, and it still could not, or would not, keep an ordinary promise to the ordinary men who built its cars. And that is the thing to hold on to, because it is the thing that actually changed. What broke those men was not a crime. It was the absence of a law. They were failed not by a villain twirling a mustache, but by a gap, a hole in the floor that nobody had bothered to cover, because until the company underneath them died, nobody had needed to. And here is the strange, quiet dignity in it. It took their calamity, a calamity and not a crime, to finally make the country cover that hole for everyone who came after. Their loss is the reason the loss stopped happening. Because that is what ERISA really did in the end. It took the three weaknesses that destroyed those men and closed all three. It forced companies to actually keep the money in the fund, so the promise could not just be empty. It set real rules for when your benefits became yours, so they could not be dangled and yanked away. And it built the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation to stand behind the whole thing, the backstop that did not exist in 1963, the one that Walter Reuther had imagined and did not live to see. Every one of those fixes is a direct answer to something specific that happened in South Bend. The law is, in a real sense, a photograph of the disaster, printed in reverse. So the next time you hear that your pension is protected, that there are federal rules, that there is some agency standing behind the promise your employer made you, understand exactly where that came from. It did not come from a policy paper, or a think tank, or a clever idea in a comfortable room. It came from a silent factory in Indiana, 5 days before Christmas, in 1963. It came from a reporter watching men refuse to believe the headline at Gate 1 on Sample Street. It came from blank obituaries in a local newspaper. And most of all, it came from a group of 52-year-old men who had given 23 years of their lives to a company, who were too old to work and too young to die, and who got 15 cents on the dollar and no way to fight it, so that 30 million people they would never meet, people not yet born, could one day get everything they were promised. The car is still sitting there behind the glass. Somebody promised it a second century and it never got one. But because of the men who built it and because of what happened to them, the rest of us got a law.